This Future Cities Africa episode is brought to you in partnership with GreenCape. Visit them at greencape.co.za. The Climate Finance Accelerator, or CFA, is a £10 million 4-year initiative of the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Working in 8 middle-income countries, it brings together project developers, government and financiers to improve the supply chain for climate finance and flow of investable projects supporting national commitments to the Paris Agreement. The program launched formally in April 2021, and its first 6 country partners are Nigeria, South Africa, Colombia, Mexico, Peru and Turkey. It directly responds to the urgency and scale of the climate crisis by supporting high-promising climate projects to become more bankable and appealing to investors, so that they can secure funding more readily. The CFA approach addresses the fact that there is money available for climate finance, but it is often difficult for it to flow to the places where it is needed. The global program is delivered by PwC in collaboration with Ricardo. The National Business Initiative, in partnership with GreenCape, have been appointed as the national delivery partners for the CFA South Africa. To discuss the CFA on Future Cities Africa today, my guests are Ian Callaghan, the originator of Climate Finance Accelerator and advisor to the UK government on the program, Mike Mulcahy, Chief Executive Officer at GreenCape, and John Gibss, Infrastructure Finance Advisor for the CFA. Gentlemen, welcome. Ian, what is the CFA and how did it come about?
So the starting point for the CFA was the realization after Paris that although that agreement had been a great political triumph, bringing so many countries together, actually nobody had the first idea where the money was going to come from to pay for all of this. And, the bill for implementing all the kind of commitments that countries had made ran into the trillions every year. And secondly, there was a realization that the vast majority probably of that money had to come from the private sector, because clearly there was no way that public funds could foot that bill, and that for that private sector money to come in, there would need to be a huge scaling up of techniques like blended finance, which can help the private sector to come into financing technologies that they have had no exposure to in the past, and which they don't really understand how to finance. And 5 years after Paris, we're still probably only raising about a quarter of what we need to raise. So there's a huge gap out there. So CFA is a technical assistance project. It's not a funding mechanism in itself. It's operating now in 6 countries after a pilot phase that ran between 2017 and 2020. So the 6 countries are all larger middle-income economies with relatively large and sophisticated private finance sectors, because that's the sweet spot of CFA to work with. The private finance providers. So the 6 countries are South Africa, obviously, Nigeria, Peru, Turkey, Colombia, and Mexico. And we'll add another 2 countries before the end of this year. So in total, there'll be 8 countries. So what we're basically trying to do is to make the project pipeline in each of those countries more bankable, more investable by the private sector. And we do that through a process that I think we'll come on to in more detail later, but it's effectively a capacity building process with project developers and entrepreneurs. But at the same time, we try to use this bottom-up approach of working with real-life projects, looking for real-life money, to make recommendations to governments on enabling environment changes that would help in practical ways to actually smooth the pathway for climate-friendly projects and businesses.
And John, why is it so hard for low carbon projects to find suitable investments?
Yeah, I mean, Ian has just touched on this a little bit, but I mean, the starting point is always that there is money available for good projects. It's not a lack of money here; it's a lack of bankable projects which are in a sensible position to engage with investors and funders, and that's really what this program is trying to address. But what you've got here is a newer technology sector. Lots of projects in the low carbon sector would count as innovative. Technologies are often not fully proven. They're coming to the market quite early, so investors and funders are not used to the projects that are being presented to them. And the issue here is that there's no special favours in the funding market. You might have low carbon investors who have built up real experience and technology to be able to spot, for want of a better phrase, winners in that sector. But the vast majority of investors and funders who are looking at these projects don't have specific experience, and they're having to pick and choose projects based on the level of risk to which they're willing to be exposed and the markets to which they want exposure. And so it's really important that projects go to the markets, understanding what the markets are looking for, and not thinking just because I've got a great idea, they're going to pass money. And so a lot of our work is around helping those project proponents to understand what the markets will want, and then to the extent we can help them to structure their offering to the markets in a way that makes sense. And it's not a new problem, to be clear. I mean, it just happens to be the sector we're focused on. But I mean, I've been working on infrastructure projects for 25, 30 years now. And we used to talk about the problem being the valley of death, that you can have a project that might work on the tabletop or at the pilot stage in a university laboratory, but getting from that initial stage to a fully scaled up operational commercial facility is really, really difficult. And it takes a specific set of skills on the funder side as well as on the proponent side. Now, look, from what we've seen, a lot of the projects that we're seeing are fundamentally in that space. And so we're trying to help them, we're trying to help bridge a gap, which isn't new. It's not specific to the low carbon sector, in my view. It's a broader sector. It's just we're focused on a particular group of projects.
Ian, the CFA is now operating in the countries that you've mentioned. How have you understood the climate finance landscape in each country?
Yeah, so the first thing we do in the CFA process is to do a mapping of the local climate finance ecosystem. So who are the players, who are the key stakeholders, and where are the gaps? So we do that in all the usual ways through interviews and surveys and desk research, but critically we also depend on our local delivery partners, in this case NBI and GreenCape, who obviously have a really deep understanding of the market in South Africa. And what we're looking at is how the ecosystem is provided for along the various stages of what we call the climate finance supply chain. So that's the process of, the initial bright spark idea that someone has for a project or a business, through the development phase that John referred to earlier, to a stage where you can put it, believably and credibly in front of bankers and investors, and ask them for some money to fund it. And there are different types of finance which are appropriate to each of those phases in the supply chain. So we're looking at whether that money is available to project developers and entrepreneurs or not. And typically what you find, and this is true across all 6 countries, I would say, that we've mapped so far in the CFA, is that there are really significant gaps in the first 2 stages. So the initiation of the project and then its development into a bankable proposal. And that's where projects need, at the outset, both access to capacity building services, but also probably some grants. And then in the second phase, they need access to angel investors, venture capital, but still some grants and concessional money in order to get them to a stage where they can actually start to earn revenues and build some kind of cash flow profile. And everywhere I think there are similar shortages, which in a way is a problem, but in a way is also a good thing, I think, because I think similar fixes will apply in each of these countries that we're dealing with, and therefore, by extension, in other similar countries with similar kind of ecosystems. So those are gaps that need to be filled by ODA providers, government, and even philanthropies, the kind of people that are able to create grant facilities or project readiness facilities or whatever. So that's the first stage. We've completed that in South Africa, and we'll be publishing the results later in October.
Mike, when GreenCape heard about the CFA, what was your reaction, and how did you think it could help in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. So when we heard about the CFA program, we were incredibly excited. GreenCape's sort of fundamental theory of change is to try to look at green economy technologies and solutions that are inherently economically viable, but for some reason aren't reaching commercial viability. And then we try and understand what that barrier is to commercial viability, and then we see if we can put together a project or a program to remove that barrier. So sort of common examples of this kind of work are things like tariff design for renewable energy, policy, legal, skills, information asymmetry. All of these are the kinds of barriers that we frequently tackle to try to allow these economically viable green technology projects to reach commercial viability. And obviously finance is a massive barrier, particularly to early stage tech, and particularly to technologies that are emerging in the developing world context, that are solving problems that perhaps aren't as generic as you'd expect. So GreenCape as an organization is a not-for-profit. We've got about 2,000 members that are companies. On this project, we've partnered with the NBI, the National Business Initiative. They typically represent large companies in South Africa. And we've been really excited to identify projects that are on the ground in South Africa that meet these kind of criteria for the Climate Finance Accelerator. I think kind of our hope as GreenCape is that you start to consider more of a end-to-end solution in the climate finance space. So I guess at an earlier stage to CFA, we've set up something called a Green Outcomes Fund that's really looking at SMMEs and much smaller ticket size deals. And then the CFA is looking at a bit larger scale projects, particularly in the infrastructure space, which adds a real complementarity to the work that we're already doing. I think kind of the value add or the sort of insights that the team was able to bring to a project like this are around understanding how infrastructure markets work for green tech in South Africa. So in particular, things around water management, energy and energy infrastructure, and waste management, which have been big portions of this project and big portions of the identified projects that have submitted applications. Obviously, we're super optimistic that at least a handful of those will be able to build the capacity to be able to draw down on funding and actually execute. And then I think just the kind of the gap at the moment, and I think John already touched on it, is there's plenty of project developers that are running around with ideas and technologies that they've clearly convinced themselves are going to be game changing, but aren't necessarily able yet or capable of communicating their projects in the language that's understandable to the finance community, in a language that's compatible with actually being able to receive the sorts of funding that they require to advance to the next stage of their project. So all of this is designed to sort of close that gap where you've got a ton of money that's looking for projects and a ton of projects that are looking for money. And if you can do a bit of that matchmaking, you can hopefully get some green tech infrastructure on the ground in a developing world context.
John, What kinds of projects are applying to be part of the CFA, and what kind of needs do they have?
Sure. Well, so in the context of South Africa, we've had actually a very, very good response to the call for proposals from proponents, with well over 100 proposals received in our first in the first call. Quite a variety of sectors covered. Perhaps about 50% would be, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the South African context, in the energy space, but a lot of projects as well in the waste space. And not just waste to energy, it's also things like black soldier flies, so people trying to treat waste in innovative ways. A number of projects in the transport, housing, agricultural space, but far smaller numbers. What's interesting, as you go through a process that we've been through of reviewing those projects, we've also had a process of clarification and had some face-to-face interviews. The number of projects that are being taken forward by the programme are substantially reduced, but it's still the key sectors, energy, waste, transport, which are coming through as the most promising projects. And they're the projects which are generally the best articulated for the purposes of communicating with a funding market. In terms of size, we're probably looking at the medium range projects in general, something above about 5 to 10 million. Some are a bit bigger than that. The smaller projects, you run into real projects around the cost of progressing those projects. Once you engage with funders, just the critical, they don't have the critical mass that's really required to justify the detailed discussions and negotiations. I mean, in terms of types of projects, the projects which have come through most strongly have generally been business to business. People have been proposing public-private partnership IPP structures, but they're not really the best focus for the CFA's input, primarily because eventually they're going to have to go through public procurement, particularly under the South Africa's very well-defined public procurement frameworks. When we look at other countries, we've been looking at projects from Mexico and Turkey. Perhaps fewer projects coming through into this programme. That may simply reflect that they have a wider range of alternative options that they can look at for funding, or it may just reflect the dynamism of the South African market, because there does seem to be a lot of activity out here. I mean, in terms of sectors, similar themes, but there are certain, perhaps more property projects which have come through in certain markets, more energy efficiency projects in others. So it depends a little bit on the focus of a specific country. What's been, I think, encouraging in South Africa is just how wide-ranging the projects have been. And there's clearly a lot of activity here. So Ian may touch on this, but I don't think this is intended to be a single round process in the CFA. And I think there are projects that we're seeing at very early stage, which will come back perhaps later when they've had more time to do more work and take the project forward. In terms of what they're looking for, the best prepared projects are generally at a stage where they're looking for access to investors or funders. But we're also seeing a lot of projects which are at an earlier stage, pre-feasibility or even just conceptual stage, and where they're really looking for coaching and technical assistance, perhaps deep insights into the specific markets that they're trying to tackle.
Ian, the South African CFA projects have been identified. What are the next steps for these projects?
So as John said, we had something like 120 responses to the call for proposals. We first whittled that down to 40 and then finally to 13 projects that we'll take forward. We've tried to give some kind of feedback to all of the projects that we weren't able to take forward as to what they might think about in terms of improving their prospects as they continue their journeys. But where we are now with the 13 is that we're embarked on a pretty intensive capacity building and technical assistance process that will have lasted about 6 weeks or so by the time we get to the final stage, which is a 4-day workshop period that will take place in the last week of October. And there we bring the projects kind of face to face, as it were, although this time around it'll have to be virtual, with teams of finance experts that we pull together. And each team consists of typically a commercial banker, private equity, and venture capital, and then someone with a development finance capability, because often what you're looking for here are blended finance solutions to these to the needs of these project developers and entrepreneurs, because few of them, as we've said earlier, are yet standard financing kind of propositions for commercial banks in particular. So by the end of the week, we hope to have pulled those projects apart and put them back together again in a better state in terms of their financeability. But then we'll also, as we mentioned before, try to make some suggestions as to enabling environment improvements that policymakers might want to think about. And then hopefully the projects will go forward and be picked up by real life providers of the cash that they need. What happens next with the CFA is that we'll run a similar process, but aimed more at projects that are looking for international finance, and the workshop process there will happen in London sometime in 2022. And then the final stage of the CFA is to try to embed a sort of ongoing process within each country that we're working with, completely tailored to the local ecosystem, but playing this role of what I call convener of pipeline, or convener of bankable pipeline, someone that can actually help to, on an ongoing process, bring together, pipeline which is addressing the sustainable development needs of each country, but with projects that are investable by mainstream finance. So that's the long-term ambition of the CFA. But we've got a couple more years of work in each of the countries to get to that stage.
And finally, gentlemen, what are the major challenges standing in the way of the success of the CFA? And if I had to give you a magic wand, how would you solve these challenges?
It's hard to imagine a magic wand properly, because we do so much system constraint bounded thinking on trying to look for solutions that are implementable. So my solution might not be as creative as if I'd had a bit more time, but I really think that seeing portfolios of projects and spreading risk across portfolios of infrastructure projects, particularly in emerging green tech, would be spectacular. So I think in so many cases, projects are looked at on a project by project basis rather than at a portfolio level. So there's clearly a need for an energy solution and a transport solution and a waste management solution. And trying to see that as a portfolio rather than a system of individual projects that need to basically be able to stand on their own means that you might be able to capture kind of the full economic suite of benefits from portfolio rather than individuals. That's actually practical-ish, and something that we're hoping to get right with some municipalities this side of the world. I think from the magic wand perspective, it really is just getting that communication and skills gap closed between those that have money to disperse and those that need it. And it's incredible to watch the level of frustration on both sides of that table, because the guys with money are so frustrated that people can't communicate to them properly, and then the entrepreneurs are equally frustrated that they keep bashing their heads against the wall trying to find something that clearly makes sense to them. So perhaps some kind of language advancement or basically to close that gap would be pretty spectacular. It would put us all out of the job, but it would be a spectacular gap to close.
I mean, I actually think, looking at the projects that are coming across our desk, we need to solve a problem which is already, or again, it's a problem that already exists. And that's that most of these projects need more support in developing their propositions. They need project preparation or business preparation funding. And there is a lot of talk about that, has been for many years. And agencies like the DBSA in South Africa have project prep funding facilities, as do other DFIs. Those facilities are relatively underused because they are really difficult to access. And I think if there was a way of either improving access to the existing funds or coming up with ways to, maybe it is creating a pooled funding system so that people can access funds which they then repay if they become successful businesses, but actually get the support they need to put the projects into the form that the banks and the investors recognise. I mean, we're having discussions with some of the parties that we've shortlisted, where the first thing they say at the top of their list is legal advice. That's expensive. We know that. So that's where project prep funding should come in. And there is a real problem at the moment in accessing that funding. So if I had a magic wand, it would, I think, be to create a proper structure for that type of funding. And that's when we're certainly going to have to be concessionary in the context of a lot of these new innovative technologies we're looking at.
Well, I would probably have given a similar kind of answer to Mike and John around this sort of project preparation and the funding for that. And there is a lot of money that could go into that through development assistance, DFI type money, and even philanthropies. But the other thing I think that's missing in all the markets that we look at is skilled intermediation at those earlier stages of projects. So that's parties that know who the financiers are, who have the money, and know who the people are that need the money, and are able to bring them together in ways that are hopefully productive. But the problem is that there's no one to pay those intermediaries at this early stage, and so finding some way of bridging that gap, I think, would also be massively helpful, because for any market to work, you need intermediation. And where that's lacking, blockages are created. So if I had a magic wand, I would probably wave it over the intermediation part of this, as well as the project preparation part of it.
If you could wave that wand, who would you get to fix it?
Well, the problem is, and here we get quite technical, grant providers hate paying what they think of as middlemen. Or middle persons, or whatever you would, whatever phrase you would use these days. So it's a really tough nut to crack. But unless those intermediaries are there, and that's the role that CFA is really trying to play in a sort of disinterested way, then there will always be inefficiencies. So I think someone has to bite that bullet at some point.